the civilized mode of conduct, or simply ritual. Edward Shears, who passed away recently, professor of sociology at University of Chicago, reflected upon the classical Confucian project, commented that one of the most important contributions that Confucius made to our conception of a modern civil society, which of course is considered quite absent in Chinese historical experience, is the idea of civility. The word civil we used in describing a modern civil society is contrasted first with a military society. So a civil society is radically different from a military society. A civil society is civilized as opposed to barbaric, the society that, like the Spartan society, exercised brute force. On civil society also is contrasted with simply the official side, the bureaucratic mechanism of the government. It's the civil side of the society, meaning the private organizations of various kinds that would generate social political organizations not directly connected with the central government. So civil means it's different from military, different from barbaric, and also different from simply official bureaucratic. The emphasis is on the civilian side as opposed to the military, the civilized as opposed to the use of brute force, and it depends upon private initiatives rather than official sanction. And Edward Shears discovered a number of elements of this modern idea of society in the Confucian tradition, especially based upon his close reading of the Analects, of the Book of Mencius, and of Xunzi. He, of course, is not a sinologist, but a major sociologist with broad interest in comparative civilizational studies. He's very much impressed by the Confucian idea that a government ought to be a limited government in terms of exercising control. But in terms of the governmental responsibility, it has to be a maximum government. The government is comprehensively responsible for the well-being of the society, but it should exercise restraint in terms of the actual functioning of society. He also discovered in the Analects in particular, but also in Book of Mencius and Xunzi, the political arena with emphasis on public opinion is very widespread. There's a concern for the public domain. Even there's an assumption, which was a surprise to me, this article was published quite recently, surprise to me that he believes in his reading there's a faith in the moral and political potential of the common people. The common people are invited to be an integral part of this political process. Therefore, the emphasis is not on rule by law, even though rule by law is recognized by the Confucians as a minimum requirement for any form of social stability. The emphasis is on encouragement through ritual. If you govern the people by law, they will follow you. They may not violate law, but they do not have a sense of shame. If you introduce the idea of ritual, people will become moral and will also develop a sense of shame. Therefore, education through ritual as a way of organizing society represents a higher order of social integration than simply society governed by law. So the important thing to remember is that the Confucians are not opposed to the government by law. They only argue the government by law exclusively is a limited political project. And Edward Shears also discovered a number of very important values for any modern civil society that are greatly emphasized in the classical Confucian literature. The idea of trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is not only the trust of the people, you can rely upon the people, but also the demand that political leadership ought to be publicly accountable. So the people have the right to ask for certain kind of performance of the government. Of course, later we have the whole idea of the mandate of heaven, but just in general, there's a potential moral sense what the government ought to be. So what kind of behavior that the political leadership would have to train themselves to assume the proper posture in terms of political governance. There's also the idea of respect. Respect for others, respect for those who are in authority, but authoritative figures will have to show respect for the people, their ministers, to be sure, but also people in general. And Edward Shears also believed there is flexibility as opposed to the rigid legal system of control. Ritual is a much more flexible mode of social education than the legal constraint. And also there's breadth, in the sense, its comprehensiveness. It's not only interested in behavior, it is also interested in attitude, in belief. In other words, it's not simply whether we behave correctly, but whether our attitude has been trained to be congenial to social stability, and also whether we have the right ideas, the right belief in understanding how society functions. These dimensions, not just the behavioral dimension, but the attitudinal and even belief are also part of the process. And finally, he also mentions tolerance. He believes there's a multiplicity of spiritual paths allowed, therefore at least the coexistence of different kinds of faith communities within this, of course, highly idealized civil society. And Edward Shears, in his development of this idea of civility in classical Confucian humanism, is very much informed by the idea of a sociologist by the name of Emil Durkheim in his idea of the division of labor. A society of that nature is not organized simply according to mechanical solidarity. It's organized according to organic solidarity. Organic solidarity is based upon a conception of the division of labor. Let's not go into the whole question about whether that division of labor is fair or not. The recognition of the division of labor in classical thought itself is extremely important. The society is organized not by the same group of people, but by a large group of people with different social functions. In the classical Confucian division, the division of labor is based upon farmers, laborers, and merchants. Now, many people argue that the Confucians look down upon merchants. Let's leave that question aside for the time being. But in their conception of society, they believe that farmers are absolutely crucial because the agricultural productivity provides the sustenance for any society. They believe the importance of laborers in the society. These are not slaves, not in the classical Greek sense, slaves. These are not ordinary laborers, but also merchants. They believe these three social groups are important in the formation of any complex society. And they made a special plead, a kind of special pleading for a fourth group, and they considered critical. Now, in some social philosophies, it's very difficult to recognize the importance of the fourth group. The fourth group, from the Confucian point of view, is the group of the scholars. The scholars should be considered as an integral part of a society also played a very important function. There are two major functions that the scholars play in the society. The first one is administration. You can use modern terms, managerial task. They do not produce in the normal sense of the term, but they manage. So the administrative function of scholars. But more importantly, especially in reference to Durkheim, I mentioned him before, Durkheim believes that society is not simply made of individuals. There is collective consciousness in society. The society is always more than the collection of individuals. There's a certain kind of ethos of the society he calls collective consciousness or conscience. Now, this collective consciousness has to be recognized and has to be developed. The Confucians believe that the scholars should play a very important role in the maintenance, sometimes even purification of the collective consciousness of a society. To use a different expression, they believe that a society comes into being because there is, in addition to the various kinds of social, political, economic functions, there is a cultural ethos. The cultural ethos is based upon a meaning structure. The society has certain kind of meaning that most of the people would consider useful, worthwhile. And the scholar, one of the major functions of the scholar is to maintain that the meaning of the society or the goal, the ultimate aims of the society is being discussed, being transmitted to the people as a whole. So the function of the scholar is twofold: to help to administer the society, to manage it, but also to maintain the meaning structure of society. And the meaning structure of society in this sense is to develop a general moral direction. What is society for? Not just simply we want to live or even to live peacefully, but we want to allow our potential as moral agents to develop. And the society should provide the context in which these spiritual aspirations, these moral aspirations can be realized. So the society is not simply a place where we coexist like other animals. As human beings, we aspire to something much higher. That aspiration, individually, collectively, can be accommodated or even encouraged by society. So society then is not simply what the political scientists, the sociologists, the economists tell us what the society is. The society is a moral community. Now, Herbert Finger Red, whose book is the assignment for this week, Confucius, Secular as Sacred. Originally, when he looked at the Confucian Analects, he was not at all impressed. A set of prosaic, archaic irrelevances. This is the term that he used when he first read the Confucian Analects. Later, when he reread it and studied it very carefully, he was impressed by the Analects in terms of its grandiose vision. And he considered one of the greatest moral and social visions in human history. In order to capture that vision, he used the term the Holy Rite, R-I-T-E, the Holy Rite, or sacred community. What Confucius envisions the society to be, as I pointed out in terms of Durkheim's notion, or Edward Shear's notion, is that a society is a moral community, is a place in which the moral agents of all its members can realize themselves. Not just the rulers, but every human being in that community has a chance of developing themselves as moral agents. And of course, being moral in this sense is being spiritual as well. Later we'll develop that theme. And this idea of the moral community is based upon Herbert Finger Red's reading of the Confucian idea of ritual. Therefore, on the cover of that book, you have this character, Li, which is the unsimplified form. The simplified form is this one, Li, which means ritual. Ritual on the surface is simply a ceremonial act. I was trying to figure out a way of introducing this particular dimension of Confucian humanism. And I was helped by a statement by Emerson, which is now inscribed at the gate leading from the yard to the science center over that side. The statement simply reads as follows. In 1836, when he took part in the graduation ceremony called the Jamboree and the Jubilee, in the Jubilee, he made a general observation. This is what he talked about, the Jubilee, which means a graduate ceremony. And I want you to note the 5 words in that short statement. Pathos, ghosts, anointed eye, spirits, eternity. A very short statement. You may want to look at it again. It's beautifully inscribed at the gate leading from the yard to the science center. I went to the college Jubilee on the 8th instant, a noble and well thought of anniversary. The pathos of the occasion was extreme and not much noted by the speakers. Cambridge at any time is full of ghosts. But on that day, the anointed eye saw the crowd of spirits that mingle with the procession in the vast spaces, year by year, as the classes proceeded, and then the far along train of ghosts that follow the company of men that wore before us the college honors and laureates of the state, and the long winding train reaching back into eternity. What it's trying to describe is something that I attended quite a few times, but you will attend at least once, is a graduate ceremony. Every June, the first Thursday of June, a very long procession, a procession that organized and then gradually moved to the yard. It's a very simple ceremony. But what he noticed, first of all, is the word pathos. Pathos, of course, could be a very intensified ethos of some kind. It's a kind of collective spirit. And also, he understands this, contrary to many of the speakers who didn't know what was going on, that the living is not simply the group of people who attended the ceremony. They're very much mingled by many ghosts. These ghosts or spirits, in fact, were the alumni or the deceased professors, members of the community. They always came back and attend this particular ceremony. The reason is, first of all, life is the combination of the living and the dead. So the life that we experience as the living is not simply the life that we observe as ordinary activities. The life itself is infused with a great deal of spiritual forces of the dead. Now, when Confucius asked the question about the dead, he said, if we do not know life, how can we know death? Most of the people say, well, look, the Confucians are not interested in the dead. They're only interested in life. But the paradox in that statement is precisely because Confucius is so much interested in life, and the life always involves the dead. Otherwise, your life is an impoverished life. This is the reason when in filial piety, for example, he asked the question, if you treat your parents in the filial spirit, what you should do, you should treat them when they're alive in the spirit of propriety. Bury them in the spirit of propriety, then continue to remember them in the spirit of propriety. So the spirit of propriety is to link the living with the dead. So each one of us, in this sense, is the barrier of a meaningful life which is infused by all kinds of spiritual forces. The aspirations, the ideas of the dead will have to be realized through the living. Now, Confucius asked about ghosts and spirits. He said, well, we do not know the human. Why should we worry about the ghost and spirit? The paradox there is to say the minimum requirement is to understand our life here and now without worrying about the spirits. But the full understanding or full realization of our human life here and now requires that we listen very attentively to the voices of the dead. So I think Emerson's use of the anointed eye is like the term that I use based upon my understanding of Indian philosophy, the attuned ear. The attuned ear is the ear that is attentive to the various forces that a normal ear would not be able to listen. So the speakers at the occasion you probably didn't know, but Emerson as an undergraduate going through the process with the anointed eye saw all kinds of other forces actually as integral part of this process. Now this is the meaning. If you idealize it, this is the meaning of what Fingerer would call a holy rite. So everyone who in that procession is considered to be a messenger for an idea of society that has to be reenacted time and time again. If it is not reenacted, if it is not realized, then of course the idea will never be relevant or meaningful. It is in this sense, I think it may not be a bad idea to recognize ritual or propriety as an externalization of humanity. We talk about the whole Confucian project is focused upon humanity, the idea of humanity as commiseration, as inner feeling, as inner morality. Ritual, propriety, all these translations of Li, could be understood as externalization of humanity. For humanity to realize itself, for sympathy to express itself, there must be a proper form for doing that. That proper form is ritual, is propriety. It is in this sense when Confucius' best disciple, the disciple who died young, who was considered to be fond of learning, Yan Hui, who asked Confucius about humanity. Confucius responded, conquer yourself and return to propriety is humanity. Here we have two dimensions. Humanity has two dimensions, an inner dimension and external dimension. The inner dimension is self-cultivation. The external dimension is the realization of one's inner feelings in a proper form, which is the ritual. It is in this sense that Confucius remarked, among the functions of propriety, the most valuable is that it establishes harmony. So propriety means harmony, the act of harmonization. It is the guiding principle of all things great and small. You can look at propriety in terms of dyadic relationship between two human beings. But it can also be the principle that governs the formation of a society or even the relationship between nations, or the relationship between human species and nature, or the relationship between human heart and mind and heaven. So propriety as harmony in this case requires the interplay, fruitful interplay between internal self-cultivation and the proper form externally that we'll be able to realize that form of cultivation. Now, when the questions was asked about propriety, the answers were quite simple. For example, in the ceremonial act, in the burial rite, for example, be thrifty rather than extravagant. This is more according to the principle of propriety. If you have a very elaborate ceremony and the feelings that should be evoked in the ceremony are absent, no matter how elaborate that is, how correct you perform the act, it is not in accordance with the spirit of propriety at all. So the important thing is to get to the essence. Therefore, be deeply sorrowful. If this is a morning ritual, be deeply sorrowful rather than shallow in sentiment. So the form has to be a fitting expression of the inner feelings. If it is not, it becomes extravagant, becomes external, becomes superficial. And it is not the proper form. In this sense, that ritual has to undergo a transformation. Ritual changes, unlike legal constraints, rule and regulations. They're very strict and they're very precise. And ritual, there's always room for negotiation. You can even say it's a feedback, there is a feedback mechanism because ritual is artificially constructed, collectively by human beings directly involved. And its change, its transformation is also a gradual one. It's very difficult to change rituals, and yet the ritual structure always changes. It's a gradual process. So another very important idea, in addition to harmony to ritual, is the idea of timeliness. It has to be a timely response to the external situations in which we live. So ritual has to change according to our feelings, our social needs. It is not superimposed upon the society from outside. But the change has to be a gradual process. It's not like change direction when you ride a bike. You can stop and make 180-degree change. It's more like changing of the direction of a canoe. You float with the river and you change it gradually. If you try to change it abruptly, you will not be able to do that. And that process of changing according to the specific time becomes critical. So in this sense, I want to share one idea about the notion that rituals can become outmoded. Rituals can become constraining and even suffocating. And in that sense, we have to change the rituals according to the principle of humanity. So ritual has to be governed by a higher principle. Itself is not fixed in a way that you cannot do anything about it. If you look at the 5 relationships and the so-called 3 bonds, I will argue that the 5 relationships, at least the underlying structure or the logic of the 5 relationships, may still be relevant and meaningful to us today. Whereas the 3 bonds are totally outmoded. They have to be abandoned. They have to be severely critiqued as internal criticism from Confucian humanistic point of view. What are the 5 relationships? The relationship between parent and child should be governed by the principle of affection. The relationship between ruler and minister should be governed by the principle of rightness or righteousness. The relationship between older and younger siblings should be governed by the principle of a sense of sequence, respect. The relationships among friends should be governed by the principle of trust, and the relationship between husband and wife should be governed by the principle of division of labor or cooperation. These 5 relationships based upon reciprocity, always two-way traffic. It's not one way. The parents should be loving, so the children will be filial. The minister should be loyal, provided that the ruler is benevolent. The older brother should be caring, so the younger brother will be respectful. Husband and wife should share in a collaborative respect. Now, even if we do not necessarily agree the particular form of sharing, like the wife in the household, the husband outside, we can say the husband should be in the household now, do household chore, and the wife should also go out to work. But this idea of collaboration and sharing itself is still meaningful or relevant to us. But the 3 bonds are totally outmoded. The 3 bonds specify the authority of the father or the parent over the child, the father over the son, the authority of the ruler over the minister, and the authority of the husband over the wife. So the three bonds exhibit paternalism, political authoritarianism, and male domination. They may have been very important in Confucian in the past in Confucian society because of the authority of the ruler, the authority of the husband, the authority of the father. And yet it is totally outmoded. It cannot be maintained. In fact, ever since the mid-19th century, some of the best Confucians have been absolutely critical of the three bonds. Now, the five relationships can be rescued. Not only that, the spirit of the five relationships can be reenacted as a feedback mechanism for criticizing the male domination, authoritarianism, and paternalism of the three bonds. Now, if this is the picture that basically in agreement with the Confucian idea of ritual in the classical period, we are confronted this week with an extremely interesting and challenging interpretation, especially from my point of view, interpretation of Herbert Fingeret. And how do we account for some of the very powerful insights that Herbert Fingeret has developed in Confucius Secular as a Sacred in terms of the outline that I just gave concerning Confucian ritual? I'm going to move quite quickly through this particular section because you're going to read it, you're going to discuss it in your sections. Fingeret, while deeply impressed by the Confucian moral vision as a holy right, decided to raise a number of very challenging interpretive positions. The first question he raises, to me it's an important question for us all, is that you really don't have to posit the idea of an inner life, the inner life in the whole Confucian Analects. You don't have to worry about the inner life in the Confucian Analects. You can come up with a very sophisticated interpretation. And he believes the Analects does not even give us the idea of choice and responsibility. If you're part of the Holy Rite, you're part of this whole process of learning to be human according to the Confucian idea of ritual. You do not encounter the idea of crossroads, not as the existentialist try to teach us you have to choose at any juncture of your life. You don't have to choose, because what you do is to try to excel, because you are on the right path. You don't have to choose a different path. If you're learning to be human, on the path of learning to be human, you don't get off the path. There's no way you can get off it. So there's no idea of the crossroads. And since the Confucians do not believe in individuality as isolated individuals, so the idea of responsibility in the Western context is very much linked to one's individuality. Unless I have an individuality, I'm not responsible necessarily for my acts. The insanity, the people who's insane, normally we do not charge the person who's insane with moral responsibility, because the person does not know what he's doing. And only an individual could have a sense of responsibility. Thus the Confucians teach us not to be worried about choice on the one hand and responsibility on the other. If you follow Fingeret's argument, it's quite fascinating. And there's no sense of tragic of life. There's no pain and suffering. It's like the Holy Rite in that situation is not a life of constant struggle alone. It's a life of celebration, life of bliss. And also, there's very little concern for shame and guilt. Ruth Benedict developed an anthropological understanding of Asian societies as opposed to Western societies, and arguing that in Asian society, shame is more important than guilt, whereas in Western societies, guilt is more important than shame. Fingered believes that that language of guilt, especially internally generated a sense of dissatisfaction, is absent in the Confucian mode of thinking. And finally, of course, there's a sense of concern, social engagement, a concerned, he would call it concerned consciousness. But Fingered will argue that concerned consciousness is not a psychological state. You really don't have to understand the Confucian mode of thinking in psychological terms. You should always understand it in sociological terms, in terms of social relationships. And then in his final chapter, he argues that the profound person ought to be a vessel, ought to be shaped into a certain kind of implement, especially like a sacred vessel, which is useless on the surface, and yet it has its intrinsic aesthetic beauty. And yet, we have in the Confucian Analects a statement that a profound person is not a vessel. Fingered argues that all Confucian disciples can be considered as achieved in certain measure of being a very beautiful vessel. But the Confucian Analects argues that no profound person should become a vessel. How do you reconcile these two very interesting positions? Now, I give you my own interpretive stance. I think there is very powerful sense of responsibility in the Confucian Analects, even a question of critical choice. But the responsibility is to say, I am not what I ought to be, but what I ought to be as a moral agent is based upon my self-effort, my own effort. And that effort has to be generated by myself. If I fail to do that, I will have profound sense of not just shame, sociologically determined, but even a profound sense of guilt. Even though the idea of the original sin is totally absent in the Confucian tradition. The Confucian idea is to say you have to become a certain kind of implement, certain kind of vessel to be useful in society. But since each person is an end in itself, each person is not a means to an end. So the profound person always learns not simply to become a vessel, no matter how useful that vessel is. You can become a lawyer, become a doctor, become a businessman, and so forth. But as a profound person, your self-realization is not predicated on your professional accomplishments alone. If your accomplishment is none other than your professional accomplishment, then you become a particular vessel being used by a particular structure in the society which is independent of your own self-realization. So not to become a professional is an achievement. To go beyond being simply a professional is what the Confucian enjoins every human being will be able to do in order to achieve the status as a profound person. In this sense, then, the practice of ritual, the practice of Li, is never a lonely quest, never a lonely quest for certain kind of inner spirituality. Even at the risk of losing one's individual autonomy, the Confucian chooses fellowship of the like-minded people to develop themselves jointly through mutual exaltation. Remember I talked about the British philosopher David Hume. When he was alone in his study, he worried about the other minds, the outside world. But when he went to the pub and engaged himself in the conversation with the people in the pub, then these questions became not that important. For the Confucians then, The ritual act always recognizes the significant other. Through the significant other, one deepens and broadens one's selfhood. This is the meaning of the Confucian self, not only as essential relationships, but also as a dynamic process of spiritual development. As a center, it is horizontally linked. As a dynamic process, it always goes through a deepening process. And in this sense, to attain newness, any form of newness, is not only a departure from tradition, or even departure from convention, or common sense, if the common sense turned out to be good sense, but a continuous reenactment of the ritual of renewal. The ritual of renewal is to say every day, every encounter provides an opportunity for us to understand ourselves, almost like a process of daily renewal. Now, Max Weber was worried about the question, how can, this is in the political, religious arena, how can the charisma of a great leader, the founder of a new religion, the founder of a new political party, that charisma, through routinization, does not lose its vitality? How can we allow ourselves to be routinized in our daily routine without losing the sense of vitality? Normally, in a ceremonial act, for example, on graduation, on some specific occasions, that people gather together for some special occasions, we become energized. We can reenact the meaningfulness of life through those kinds of rituals, those kind of festivals, those kind of occasions. These are extraordinary occasions. But how can we do it on a daily basis? How can the ritual of living be reenacted day in and day out? It seems to me that one example that is helpful in this connection is the art of learning a foreign language. I don't know how many of you are involved. But the art of learning a foreign language, often people consider it, let me try to immerse myself in the language and master it. Once I mastered it, I can do my research and then forget about all this incredible pain in trying to domesticate a foreign language. That is totally a wrong attitude. To me, learning a language is like ritual. You have to do it day in and day out and never allow it to be a major burden. This is how we learn our first language. This is how we actually master a foreign language. It's being done as a daily ritual to make it a kind of routine, almost like a morning exercise, and to make it constant. And the art, later Mencius talk about, is do not forget, do not assist. If you artificially try to help it, to assist it, to use it, and you will become so much obsessed with that process, you may learn in a very short period of time, and you forget also in a very short period of time. So how to allow it to become part of your daily routine, your ritual, this is how you learn it. But a very large part of life is governed by daily routines and rituals. Therefore, it's easy for us to become tired because of inertia and limitation. So the notion here is, how can we allow ourselves to live in ordinary situation, highly routinized, without losing that vitality? In order to do that, finally, the Confucians recommend we have to take authority seriously. Now, this doesn't sound right, because authoritarianism is always considered such a negative idea. Even authority in the modern liberal democratic context evokes all the wrong ideas of being in control, of domination, the power to enforce laws, to exact obedience, to command, to determine, to judge. But there's another meaning of authority. which is very much a part of the English language, in English language, and it's not being very widely appreciated. Authority means an accepted source of expert information or advice. Someone is an authority on some subject, serves as expert information, source of information for that particular subject. Someone who is an authority in Shakespearean literature, for example. Authority is a power to influence or to persuade, and the influence and persuasion is based upon deep knowledge and extensive experience. So the ability to persuade is not because brute force, it's because it's informed by knowledge and experience. So how can we, in our daily routine, governed by governed by all these routinized ways of doing things, be able to develop a sense of vitality? The way to do it is to refer continuously to authentic authorities. In fact, if you study physics, you study law, you study medicine, you study any subject, you defer to the authority of those subjects in order for yourself to become learned. And that requires receptivity, flexibility, and of course, respect. And that sense of authority actually, as a ritualized power, is something that the Confucians have a great deal to say about. Authority in the English word derives from the word author, which means creator. And some scholars have argued that one very important message in the Confucian tradition is to instruct us or to teach us to become authoritative figures, to become profound people or profound persons with authority, which means acquisition of specialized knowledge, the broadening of our experience in terms of our daily routine, then through exemplary teaching, not simply through the teaching of words. And this ritualized power is something that will help us to negotiate and to navigate in a highly complex routine world without losing the sense of vitality and self-reflexivity. I'm sorry, I should have left some time for questions.